So just a bit of an intro. So John is gonna be telling us about how you can automate your Power Query game with artificial intelligence. But John also has a very interesting article or a series of articles in his blog talking about how you can bring DevOps into your Power BI development, how you can automate testing. Very interesting blog series. So I would recommend reading that. And John, you'll be pleased to know I've read all of the articles. So very good, interesting read. So without further ado, I'll hand over to you. Floor is yours, John.
Well, thank you. I appreciate it. And thanks for the opportunity. Evening, everyone. My name's John Kerski. I work for a consulting firm based out of Washington, D.C., U.S., and we focus on Power Platform work, and my specialty is in Power BI. So today, let me make sure you can see my screen. Hopefully, that pops up nicely.
Yeah, you can see that. Yeah, say John.
All right, wonderful. So today we're going to talk about commenting Power Query with Azure OpenAI. Our agenda is we're going to talk a little bit about the challenges with commenting our code in Power BI. I'll show you some techniques on how to comment code in Power Query if you're not aware of those. And then we're going to switch over to how Azure OpenAI can help us. Now, a quick aside, there is a new product that's been coming out, Copilot for Fabric. Our teams that I work with have been using Azure OpenAI before Copilot for Fabric came out. And one of the reasons we looked at it was because we knew the cost of Copilot for Fabric may be tied to premium. And so we wanted to look at maybe ways that we're only paying per usage, which I'll talk about a little bit later on the presentation. So if you're wondering where Copilot Fabric fits in and Azure OpenAI fit in, they're two separate products. We're going to focus on the Azure OpenAI component today, and I'll show you how to leverage that. And then I'll also give you a little bit of background on lessons learned from using Azure OpenAI, and it's a little bit about working with large language models in general, and I have some links for you to further educate you on working with large language models. All right, I've already told you a little bit about me, but I do want to point out I do have the QR code for the slides today. All the slides and code that I'm sharing for you are out on GitHub. The code is MIT licensed, so you're free to download and use it for your own usage. I do not give you an Azure OpenAI license. You will have to pay for that, obviously. And if you do have any questions after this meeting, feel free to contact me on X, LinkedIn, and I think there's a contact information on my blog as well. All right, so let's get into a bit of the challenge. The screen's a little bit fuzzy, but just to show of hands, how many of you ever have inherited a Power BI report and you open up Power Query and you just see something like this on the left and you're trying to figure out what exactly is going on with those models? Anybody inherit, I think the guy in the queue, people call it the ugly baby in data models?
There's lots of hands up, John.
Yeah, so this is something that I've encountered, my team's encountered, and the issue is Power Query out of the box when you add your steps. If you're merging something, it just says merge queries. So your first question is, all right, what is the table that you're merging with? And so you'll click on that merge query. And sometimes if you're working with a large model, it might take a couple minutes to pull up the window, a couple seconds. So every kind of click you're going through is taking time. Now, the two most expensive things in Power Query is going to be merges and sorts. So anytime you're going through your applied steps and you're clicking through and a merge is involved or it's ahead of it or sorts involved and it's ahead of it, it's going to slow down. So the more time you're spending clicking on the applied steps, that can be a problem. You're also trying to figure out like what column was removed. And then you get that lovely number 2 that sits there, and then the number 3. I think the max number I've ever seen on applied steps was like 20, but that was a very large applied step or Power Query file. But you spend a lot of time trying to figure out what exactly is happening in those applied steps. And this not only is just for you inheriting a Power Query or a Power BI data set or semantic model, but it's also if you worked on it and it's been a couple months and then you come back to it and you're like, oh, what did I do? I mean, I know a lot of you, I don't have that great long-term memory. I'm trying to figure out what I did 6 months ago in Power Query. You come back to it and then you're still clicking through your own code to try to figure out what's going on. So every time you're clicking, you're spending time, and time is not spent delivering features to your customers. You're spending time trying to understand the code you built. So how do we get around that? Well, commenting code is a staple of development, whether that was in the high code area or even in the low code area today. So we have some best practices on my team where when we're building code in Power Query, we try to do at least two things. And let me show you by example. So I'm going to pull up a model here. Hopefully it shows up. All right. So I've just got a very simple data model here. It's got a couple dimensions. Let me see if I can zoom in. A couple dimensions, a fact table. It pulls this data from a publicly available data set out on the 538 website, which is a well-known statistical news group in the, at least based in the US, they're well-known. And we pull this data in, it's about comic book characters and their appearance. And so the data model just has a way that you can slice and dice by date, by the color of the character's eye, whether their alignment is good, bad, or neutral. And so just to give you a little background on Power Query, what the model is doing is just pulling this together, and it's just a sample model. I have this free to download, so you can use this as well. But if you're looking over here on the right, we've got a lot of steps. So what our team will typically do is we will right-click on Advanced Editor, which is right here. And if you click on Advanced Editor, if you want to add a comment, you can hit the space here and then put in with 2 forward slashes the comment that's happening here. So I want to say I remove the first appearance column here. So when you do that, and if I hit done, what happens on the right here is a little eye icon shows up. And now you can hover over this without actually having to click on the step and see what's happened. And it can be a pretty lengthy step as well. You can get a very large comment field. And so that's one of the ways that when we're doing code reviews, we'll make sure that, oh, are you commenting your code? Can I at least hover over merges, sorts, removes, and adds and see comments? And if I see those, then I know that the data model is in good shape for us to maintain in the future. The other thing we'll do is we'll just do the simple right-click and rename, removed first appearance. That's another way you can do it. And this is really helpful, and we try to instill this on our team when we're working with custom columns. So if we want to add a custom column, and in this case, this is just adding in a date column, we're going to we do something like added custom date. Or if I go down here and you see I've got a custom column that is calculating the numbers between two dates as a list, I'm going to rename that to added custom date list. And so now as I'm looking through here, these ones stick out more than anything else, that I know what's happening between those steps without actually having to click on each one. And that saves us time. And time that's not spent trying to understand the code, it's time more well spent trying to deliver what changes you need to make for your customers. So that's the typical process that our teams kind of instill in a best practices. Now, when it comes to commenting code, and if you come from the other, actually maybe a a good survey for the room. How many of you work with JavaScript or C# or SQL or any other programming languages? All right, so commenting code is something that's been around for a little bit, but commenting code is always a challenge because you're under the pressure to deliver, you're just trying to get your code done, and then you're trying to get it out the door and have it working. Commenting sometimes is an afterthought, and often actually is an afterthought. And when it comes to getting new developers and other teams to adopt commenting code, it is the last thing you want to do. You want to push it away. That's something that we'll deal with later. And when we would do our code reviews, a lot of times, especially with our junior mid Power BI developers, this was something we had to keep reinstilling. And they'd always say, hey, this takes time. I got to go through each step and I got to make these changes. And so we took a look at, well, maybe there's other ways to take advantage and do commenting code without adding more overhead on the team. And that's what brought us to looking at artificial intelligence to help us maybe comment the code for us, or at least get us to a point where we can comment our code, or at least preliminary comment the code, and then make adjustments on the fly. So what I'm going to show you today is a example using that sample model on how we're going to leverage Azure OpenAI to comment the code and offer the way to change the step names. And I'm going to go through that step by step. So we're going to see the Power Query involved. We're going to see the Azure OpenAI involved. And I'm hoping that after this, you can use this information to maybe download and try it out yourself and get a better understanding of how you could use this tool to assist with your commenting, or even get you started with working with large language models if you haven't worked with them before within Power Query. So in order to do this, you need to have a couple things set up. The first is you need at least a premium per user Fabric workspace. Now, the reason you need that is you need a XMLA connection capability to query the data set that's sitting in your service, to let to query and understand what's the M code that's using to run this data set. So that's the first thing you need. The second is you're going to need Azure OpenAI. And the example I'm using today is the ChatGPT 4.0 model. I'll show you how I set that up. Azure OpenAI is a resource that you can purchase on an Azure tenant. It is something that is not associated with Power BI directly. So you have to go to portal.azure.com, purchase or set up Azure OpenAI. And I have links to how you would set that up, but I'll show you a couple of the steps on what that looks like in the portal as well. Now, in terms of the demo, I want to highlight, we're going to take a semantic model, which is the sample model that I'm using, and then we're going to run it through a data flow. Now, the reason we want to use a data flow, and I've set up a data flow Gen 1, not a Gen 2 for right now. So because Gen 1's still the most accessible to most teams. The reason we want to use a data flow is the data flow is a little more, stable in terms of dealing with API calls. If you work with the API calls to Azure OpenAI and you're making these calls and you're making changes, it's making these calls several times as you're making changes to the code. And every time you make a call to Azure OpenAI, you're putting a money in the jar for Microsoft. So they charge you for every time you make those queries. A data flow is going to be a little more stable because once you have the code set up, you don't need to open the file. You just need to run the data flow, and then it will call Azure OpenAI. I've seen it in terms of comparing it to running this in a data set versus a data flow. It is cheaper running it in a data flow. So once it gets into this data flow, the data flow is going to use Azure OpenAI to ask Azure OpenAI or ChatGPT specifically, tell me what this line of M code is doing, and then give me the comment. And then in the data flow, we're going to switch out or add the comment in front of each step. I'm also going to ask, or the data flow is going to ask ChatGPT or the GPT 4.0 in Azure OpenAI, what would be your suggested step name based on what you see this code is? And give me that as well. And then finally, you're going to get a report that you can leverage that shows you the original Power Query code and what the enhanced version of that Power Query code would look like with either additional comments or additional comments and variable name changes. And I'll show you that more in depth. Now, you could take this step further and just have the code automatically switch out in your data model. For the purpose of the demo, I'm just giving you the step where it gets to a point where you can copy the code. Now, the reason I do that is I'm a big proponent of testing. So you always want to test your code changes. So I wouldn't want to have to automatically update your data model or have the code update your data model without you testing. That's a little scary. So I'll show you how to copy the Power Query code into your model as part of the demo. All right, now all the code that I am going to show you in this demo is on my GitHub page. You can download that. It includes instructions as well. Let me get to this is the GitHub page. And I have kind of a breakdown of all the installation instructions, how you set everything up. I will note, and there is something you want to consider, is when you set up your Azure OpenAI service, you're going to use a key, which is a private key, to authenticate with Azure OpenAI. That key is going to sit in your data flow. Now, best practice is you don't give people access to that data flow unless they need access, unless they already have access to the key, because that key can be used to use any sort of prompting to Azure OpenAI. So that's a secret you want to keep. Also, at the end of this presentation, I have some links. I really think Microsoft could do a better job of letting us store those keys securely in Power Query. Today, you can't connect Azure Key Vault to that. You can do it in a notebook, which is part of Fabric, but you can't do it in Power Query. You should be allowed to do that. That is something that I hope Microsoft will fix here in the future. All right, so let's go to the Azure OpenAI component first. So on this website up here, this is my tenant. I have created an Azure OpenAI resource. That Azure OpenAI resource is based in this location. My suggestion is, I think for the most part, you can create it in any of the commercially available environments at this point. You probably want to keep the Azure OpenAI location close to where your Power BI service is located, just for networking and latency. Now, when you create this doesn't automatically create ChatGPT or a service for you. It gives you basically a container to set up multiple models. And those models are under something called model deployments. Now, what's weird about Azure OpenAI is once you click on model deployments, you got to click on manage deployments. I don't know why you got to go to another screen. But when you click on that screen, it's going to take you to Azure OpenAI Studio up here. And you're going to see a ability to create a new deployment or edit existing deployments. And if you click on the create new deployment, you're going to get several models to choose from. Now, depending on what environment you have set up, you may have a couple more, you may have a couple less. And these are changing at least on a quarterly basis at this point. ChatGPT 3.5 is out there. The one I've tested or showed you with, I've used it with ChatGPT 4. I've tested it with ChatGPT 3.5. It works all right. The comments are not as great. ChatGPT 4, the comments start to get much better. Now, when you create that deployment, you're going to give it a name. And that name is really important to remember. And the reason is this name that I've created, I called it PBI4. This name is what actually makes up the API URL that you're going to use. And I'll show you what that looks like. Unfortunately, there isn't a kind of a standard API URL that you're going to use across any ChatGPT Azure OpenAI implementation. It's based on the resource name that you created as well as the deployment name, and I'll show you what that looks like. But I was kind of hoping there was a way when you're using or templating this that you could automatically switch those in and out. Unfortunately, you got to create the URL yourself. So once you have that deployment, I just clicked on that deployment name. You can see, you can actually work with the ChatGPT playground here. Now, what's really nice about this is you can build your prompts using this chat playground. Now, remember, anytime you're using this chat playground, you're putting money in the jar for Microsoft. So just keep that in mind. Don't just paste a bunch of things and keep hitting enter, because the money's going to increase. But I use this chat playground as a way to refine my prompts, and I'll cover that a little more at the end of the presentation. So any of the prompts that I show you today in the data flow code or the Power Query code in the data flow, I tested out here first, and that let me work through issues in terms of refining the feedback or setting more boundaries on what the ChatGPT 4.0 should be returning. So the chat is kind of your test or debugging area. All right. The other thing to point out is your keys are sitting here. Now, I'm not going to show those for you, but you'll notice here, this is your endpoint, and that endpoint is named specifically to the resource that you're using. And so you're going to use this endpoint to help build the URL for your API call in the data flow. And I'll show you what that looks like right now. So I'm going to go to the data flow. This data flow is sitting on a workspace that is operating in a premium environment. And this is a template that I have out on the GitHub site. And there's several parameters we have here. The Azure OpenAI URL here is the one that I want to point out. You have to set this manually. So I copied the Azure OpenAI resource name, and then this is standard. It goes /OpenAI/deployments, and then you have to put in the deployment name. After that, this is all standard. And so when you're setting up the API to let the data flow interface with ChatGPT, you have to be very deliberate in making sure that this URL is set up correctly. So you want to make sure in portal.azure, you copy the endpoint, you put that right in front of the OpenAI, and then you switch out the deployment name with the one that you've created. And at that point, you've got the base URL for you to make queries to Azure OpenAI. Now there's the other thing here, which I'm not going to click on because it would expose the key in the presentation, is the Azure OpenAI key, which you'll keep in your data flow as a parameter. You want to make sure that this data flow is not exposed to anybody else that doesn't need access to it. Again, I'm hoping Microsoft at some point lets you just point it to Azure Key Vault and pulls that down securely. But for right now, you're keeping that in plain text in your data flow. The other parameters that you will need to run this data flow is you'll need to know where your workspace connection string is. Now, what do I mean by that? So I'm going to navigate over to the workspace. So this is the model here that I want to run the comments or have it look at the M code and give me what the comments are. If I go to workspace settings, and I click on premium, down at the bottom, let's see if Zoom In actually works, there we go, is the workspace connection. That is the XMLA endpoint to connect to the workspace. Then I have the semantic model name, which is called sample model. And then I have a flag here Now, this is a best practice, not only in this code, but anytime you're working with larger data sets or data sets that are going to make a lot of API calls or SQL calls. This flag I use when it's set to true is only going to take a portion of the data model and run it through ChatGPT. Now, why would I do that? Well, anytime I'm making a call to ChatGPT, you're putting money in Microsoft's bank. So if I'm testing things out and I only want to run maybe 1 or 2 lines of M code through the prompt, I'm going to set this to true. And at that point, I know that I've kind of minimized or parameterized the amount of data I want to send to ChatGPT. Now, when I say you keep putting money in Microsoft's account, it's really not that much. I've ran it through some very large models. When this runs through, I think after several runs, when I come in the next morning, I'm spending maybe $15 at the most. And then when you compare that with paying the cost of Copilot for Fabric right now, which is tied to a P1 instance or an F64 Fabric instance, you're between $8 and $11 an hour for just commenting code. That's a pretty good deal, handing that off. And when you can also consider that you're only paying $15 to create this commenting code, how much are you paying a developer in an hourly rate? This is Azure OpenAI can take some relief there. All right, so we've got the Power Query parameter set. We've got the Azure OpenAI set. We've connected the two. Now let's talk about how do we actually leverage the two to comment the code. Now, these are based off of a couple functions here. And the first I actually want to talk about is these two here. How many of you are familiar with the term dynamic management views? Okay, so a couple. So dynamic management views is a carryover from SQL analysis services. And it's also built into Power BI because SQL analysis services, Power BI is a superset of SSAS. You can actually query Power BI through these dynamic management views and say, hey, give me the M code. Tell me what makes up this model. And there's 2 ways to do that. And there's this select calc dependency. And when you issue that query, it was similar to a DAX query, you issue this query to the data set, it's going to give you a bunch of information about the measures, the columns, and the M code that's using to run the data model. There's also another set of code that you can run called discover M expressions. Now, the reason you have to call this in 2 different ways is one dynamic management view query is going to give you all the M code for the tables that are exposed in your data model. And the other query is going to give you all the M code for the data set that's hidden, or if you click that enable load, and I can show you what I mean by that. Here, let me go to Power Query here. Right here, if you have enable load unchecked, that is the M code that doesn't get, or the table that doesn't get shown up in your model if you're building a report. We still want that code though, because those tables are used to build your model. But you have to use 2 different queries to get to having all the M code that's used to build your data model. And when you use those, the way that this item works is I have a set of tables that will run the analysis services. So it's going to make that connection to this sample model and issue the query, the dynamic management view query. In this one, it's issuing the expression. Now you'll notice there's a bunch of comments in here. We ate our own dog food on this one. We actually ran this set of Power Query code against the commenter so that we could understand what we were doing later on. And when it is finishing processing, you will get something like this. So this is the hidden tables that are in the data model and the M code that's used to build those. So you just have table name and the M expression. You also have the same type of query, but this calls the other dynamic management view, which is discover calc dependencies, and pulls back the M code for each one of these tables. And so now that you have this M code, this is when you can start passing it to Azure OpenAI. And how do you do that with Azure OpenAI? Well, one of the things you got to do very quickly is you actually have to parse the M code, meaning each line of code or anything after a comma, we want to split up and issue it to Azure OpenAI. So every line of M code that we have, we want to issue a statement to Azure OpenAI. Now, if I wait a couple seconds, this should open up for parse commenting. Of course, I'm sharing my screen and the demo gods tell me it's going to take 34 seconds or more than 34 seconds. Shouldn't take too long, too much more. If this takes any longer, I'll switch over to the functions here. But what I wanted to illustrate is it's going to break up each line of code and then attach the prompt. And what does that prompt look like? And that's what I wanted to show you here. It's taken a little bit longer than I wanted it to, but we can always open up the Power Query code here just to illustrate what we've got. Is what it's going to do is give a number to each line of the code that we have. Because when we issue these queries to Azure OpenAI, we need to know, is this the first line of code in the M code? Is this the second line of code in the M code for the table? And that way we can kind of keep track, because since we split everything up, we got to put it back together at the end in order to have the M code actually make sense, because it's a set of instructions. All right, so you see here, it actually split up the M code. And the way you can see that is you see one line for the let, one line for the source, one line for the removed other columns. And now to the right, you're going to see this expression. Now this expression is based off of a template. And that template looks something like this. When you're working with large language models, what you want to do is set up the expectation in a large language model. So in this case, I'm saying, hey, you're going to be an assistant to help a developer comment their code. So you're laying the foundation of what needs to be done. And then the next thing you do is you say, hey, I'm going to give you a very specific piece of code, but I'm going to delimit it so that you know when the code starts and when the code ends. So this is setting the boundary. If you don't do that, you'll get some weird behavior, because large language models don't necessarily know when a certain piece of text starts and ends. So if you use something like, I use 3 ticks to denote what's the start and the end of the code. And then I'm very prescriptive on what you want the large language model to do. You want it to return a comment explaining what the piece of code is doing. Do not start the comment with the word step or a number. This was a lesson learned when I was debugging it. It was always giving me a number or saying step 1, step 2. I didn't need to know that. You can say start this comment with the phrase this step. Another thing that you could tell it to do is do not copy the comment of the code. The first time we were working with this, it was just actually just copying the line of code and saying, this is what it's doing, and then it would just paste the M code in there. That doesn't help us. And then last but not least, you set a boundary. It could write a dissertation if it wanted to, but really we want to keep maybe just to 225 characters. And then finally is the code itself, which we delimited. And so at this point, if you've had all that built out, you can issue that call to Azure OpenAI, and it's going to give you something that looks like this. So it says this step is being able to marvel source, essentially creating a reference and assigning meaningful name to a piece of data. Pretty good. This one says this step is removing all columns except the align column from the source table. This step is removing duplicate entries. So there's a lot of good comments in here that I don't have to write myself. You can use this as a starting point. Now, when it has those comments, what it's going to do at the end is put together what that looks like here. So that's that line of code with the comment now and the step. And at that point, you can merge that back in, and we merge this into the output table, which I'll show you here in a second what visually that looks like. Now, you're probably wondering, all right, you've got that M expression or the prompt to Azure OpenAI. What does that actually look like in terms of the Power Query code to actually call Azure OpenAI? Well, there's this function here called FM prompt Azure OpenAI. And what it's doing is it's taking the URL that we built as a parameter, passing in the API key, and then passing in that prompt. So pretty simple in terms of what it's doing. It's using web.contents to take a body of the content type, the API key, and a JSON representation of that prompt, pass that into Azure OpenAI, and get the content back. So once you have the API URL and the key set up, really this function can work with any sort of chat that you're going to send. And so that serves as the base function. And then really this is a wrapper function for like get comment. All I'm doing is saying, hey, pass in the prompt, which is your input, call the Azure OpenAI function, get the results, parse it, and output it. Now, the reason I do that is for if we wanted to be a little more elaborate, you can actually send multiple chat messages to that function if you wanted to. I'm just doing it one at a time. The API is very flexible. If you want to send a bunch of chats or a bunch of prompts at the same time, you can do that. So in this case, all I'm looking at is the first response because I'm only expecting one. But you could actually have it where you could parse multiple responses over time. Same thing with the comment variable expression is it's doing calling the prompt, getting the message back. So those are the functions that go out and get the comments and also do the comment variable suggestion. Now, what is the comments pretty easy because what we're having to do is insert the comment at the top. What about the name change? Well, the name change is a little more in depth in that not only do I need to get what the ChatGPT suggests is the name change, where do I replace that in the M code? Because that line of code says this step name is equal to this function, because Power Query is a function-based language. And so when ChatGPT tells me, hey, you should name that step differently, I'm actually changing the name of the function. And that's where it comes into the variable renaming, where the steps are going to say, hey, you need to take anything in the source table and replace it with that. Or you want to change the sorted rows to saying sorted table by alignment in ascending order. And so this prompt is a little bit different in the sense that I ask it what the name change is, and then I also need to do a find and replace of those name changes. And I got this function here from I have the reference in here, but this actually is a nice piece of code, not only for this ChatGPT work, but also if you're ever looking for a bulk find and replace, where you have a table of find and replace mapping, this line of code does a really good job of doing bulk find and replace. So what we do is we'll take that mapping table, that find and replace, run it through here, and it actually runs through the M code and does a bulk find and replace for all those variable names. And then finally, what you have is a table at the output this is your original Power Query code, and this is the transform Power Query code. So in the case here, I've only got two statements because I've I've put the is dev flag on. So this is what the original Power Query code looks like. And then this is what the transform code looks like. And so it's a little bit different in the sense that now we've got a bunch of step names. I can probably see here, now it's got the step names. And if there's any other components here, that's with the comments. And then I have a version of it with the comments and the changes in the names. So with this information in a data flow, you can point this to any model that you have in your workspace, as long as it's running in premium, and have it run through the M code and get the comments and get the variable name changes. And you can run this, point this at any model that you have. And depending on how big of the model, it could take a couple minutes, it could take multiple minutes. I've run through some very large models. It takes about 15 minutes to run through, maybe cost a couple dollars at the most. So what does it look like on the report side? Well, once you have that data flow and it's spat out all the commented or suggested comments for the code, I have a release here that you can download. There is a template that you can download. It's a Power BI template, and you can point it to that data flow. And what does that look like? Well, let's open up that file here real quick. Just give me 1 second. Always takes a second for that to load. All right, so when you first get open this template open, it's going to ask you two things. It's going to ask you where your data flow located and what your data flow ID is. Right there. And so the way you get that is if I go back to Internet Explorer and I go to, this is the two tables that I'm outputting. The workspace is identified after the groups. The data flow ID is identified after data flow. So what I will just do is copy that, go back to here, paste that, go back to Edge, copy this, and copy the data flow. Hopefully, if the demo gods are nice, this should only take a second to load. There we go. And what you see here is at the top is you can select the table. So I could pick the date dimension, I could pick the alignment dimension, and on the left-hand side is your original Power Query code. And on the right-hand side is, by default, the additional comments. And with the help of parameters, I can just toggle this. So if I toggle over to additional comments, you'll notice that not only is the comments there, but the steps names change are there as well. And what you can do at this point is I can right click, hit copy value. If I go back to that model, I could just go and open a new blank query. Right click on Advanced Editor. Just paste the code. And now if I'm just rename this to alignment dim enhanced, just for demo purposes, you'll see that it looks exactly the same. You'll want to test that, obviously, but you'll notice the difference is instead of it having, this is what it looked like before, this is what it looks like after. Now, as I'm going through the code, without having to write those comments myself, I can actually upgrade it and enhance it at this point, and I have some sort of indication without having to click on each one of these steps what's going on. I don't even have to hover over it. You can just do the name changes as well. And if you wanted to, at this point, say, okay, those tables look good, if you're fine with it, you could just copy that and then just replace it for your existing code. And now your code has been updated. It has comments. The step changes are a little more verbose into what you need to understand and how that's set up. And so our teams have been using this with testing as we've been adopting new data models or even enhancing some of the older data models to get us started on making sure that everything's commented correctly and we have an understanding of what we're working with. And again, you're only paying a certain amount of money, anywhere between a couple dollars to maybe 15 US dollars. I'm not sure what that converts to pounds these days, but that's still not anywhere close to what we're paying in an hourly rate for a Power BI developer. And just for myself, using this and having that run while I'm working on something else and I change over the code can save me a bunch of time on commenting code that I would normally have to do step by step as I'm working through it. Or if I need to go back and make updates, I can run it through and it will tell me what comments and what step name changes should be changed so that my code's a little more maintainable in the future. So I'm going to pause right there before I go into like the lessons learned. I'm sure some of you have questions. I'll open up to questions before I go through the lessons learned.
How long did it take to build? How long did it take to build?
So the question is, how long did it take to build? This, I think we got it, maybe ChatGPT 4 was in like private preview in September. It may be about 4 or 5 weeks, not total time. I would say the large portion of the time that was spent was understanding on how to use the prompt correctly. The web.contents and XMLA stuff, we had a lot of templates already built to like extract information from there. So that helped us get to something that was a little quicker to deliver.
Do you think within sort of a year, this could sort of be integrated in Power BI with the Copilot and sort of in a form of maybe a message, a box, auto comments, and it does the whole thing, which is, I think it's amazing, but it's still a bit technical, so it takes obviously some time to do it, and I think it's amazing. But I mean, if it was integrated, that would be, I think that's where it's going, isn't it?
Exactly. So at the end of the presentation, I have a Fabric voice, and I'm sure they're working on it because they've just started doing this with measures. It would be a lot better if I could just hit a button and it would just do it for you. The only thing that's kind of got us still using this is I know for some of the implementations I have for customers, paying $11 an hour or up to $8,000 a month in the new Fabric workspace just to comment code is not something that they want to invest in. Where I can just run it through for a couple dollars and do this. This was one of the reasons we did it, because we knew Copilot in Fabric has a lot of opportunities. It's just that, is it worth the money just to do this particular piece? And especially if I was still working with small and mid-sized companies who haven't invested in premium or haven't invested in Fabric. And I'm lucky to get a premium per user license. So that was kind of the things. But to your point, I think it's coming. It will be awesome if it's just a button in the Copilot thing in desktop. I'm hoping soon. I mean, they've got DAX queries will write for you now. That's doing all right. It writes your measures for you. It's only a matter of time for it to comment your code. And another point though is I don't think you necessarily need large language models to rename your steps. Like there's a very prescriptive way that somebody could write the Power Query interface at Microsoft to be something better than just sorted rows. It could just update it to be something a little more verbose without needing Azure OpenAI to do it for you.
Sorry, just a quick one. So the DMV function that you just showed, the dynamic management view. So I'm not familiar with it in Azure AI. So is it something that's only available in the premium per user capacity, or is it like with pro license? Are we able to use it in Power BI?
So to connect to the dynamic management views in the service through the data flow in this implementation, you do need premium. Now, I say that if you want to look at dynamic management views for another purpose, there's a wonderful tool out there, and I'm going to pull it up. How many of you use DAX Studio? All right. So if DAX Studio is free to use. If you connect, and I'll connect to the local model here, up at the top is a DMV button. It's going to give you all the different functions you can use. And I think if we find the M expressions one, I know there's a search. Oh. So you can just click and drag that. Oh, it's supported only in the premium service. There's a couple here that only work with the premium service, I've noticed, but you can use some of the other ones. Calc dependency should work. That's a really nice one where you can get a list of all the tables, objects, and expressions. So if you're interested in what does Dynamic Management View offer you, if you have Power BI Desktop and you have DAX Studio, you can work with Dynamic Management Views and see which type of data comes back here, all for free.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Janelle. Sorry to rush you, but we are overrunning a bit, so we will be able to jump to the conclusions, please.
Right. How many more minutes we got? Okay. All right. So I'll just have there's a couple links here. I went over the lessons learned here. There is something called a token limit. Just keep in mind that you can't send a dissertation in your chat prompt today. Microsoft and ChatGPT is working on ways to increase that limit. The reason I didn't send all the M code in one big prompt was because I would hit that limit. And then there's a gentleman with Greg, and I would butcher his last name. Wonderful YouTube video on how to deal with token limits. If you're working with large language models, I recommend watching this video. He teaches you a bunch of different patterns on how to work with ChatGPT prompts and working with large text. And then the security situations, and then gentleman who asked about query commenting, I have that as a Fabric Voice thing. This is something they should be providing us, or at least giving us a better way to do it. Not only just with Copilot, but just with Power Query in general. There should be a much more verbose way of it automatically understanding what your steps are. And with that, there's the QR code for the slides, and I really appreciate you all taking the time. I'm sorry I ran over a little bit, but thank you so much.